He was too bruised to stand. The giant bride lifted him and said, "No one will hurt you again." Her voice wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a promise. It was a vow hammered on iron, ringing across the dusty street, steady and unshakable. The stagecoach driver didn't even look back. He just cracked his whip, the sound like a gunshot in the thick, hot air. He wanted to be gone from this town, gone from the trouble he'd just dumped at the edge of Redemption Springs. The horses snorted, the wheels rattled, and then silence. All that was left was a beaten man on his knees in the dirt, and the towering woman who refused to let him fall. Her arms were wrapped around him with a gentleness that didn't match her size. She could have crushed him without even trying. The man's breath was ragged, each inhale a sharp stab of pain. His cheek was a swollen, purple mess. His ribs felt like shattered glass. His pride was a broken thing, bleeding out in the dust. He tried to push her away, his voice a dry rasp. Don't touch me." But the words had no strength. She didn't let go. She lifted his weight like he was nothing more than a child. Her broad shoulders squared against the watching eyes. Townfolk were gathering in doorways, peering from behind dusty windows, their whispers slithering like snakes in tall grass. "Too big for a woman," one man muttered from the saloon porch. "Bride nobody wanted," another spat into the dirt. A woman hiding behind a lace fan hissed, "She'll crush him." The giant bride ignored them all. Her jaw was set, a hard line of defiance. Her gaze was unflinching, focused only on the man whose head had sagged against her shoulder. His hat slipped, tumbling to the ground. She stooped just enough to grab it, her movements fluid and powerful, and slid it back over his battered face. Then she started walking. She carried him forward through the murmurs, through the scorn, through the heat that shimmered off the hard-packed road. He tried to speak again, his voice cracking. "Why? Why are you helping me?" His eyes fluttered, half closed against the blinding sun. She looked down at him, and for a fleeting moment, something soft flickered in her storm-gray eyes. "Because I know what it means to be left in the dirt," she said simply. Then she kept walking, step after steady step, until they reached the porch of the boarding house, where the shade offered a sliver of mercy from the burning sun. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a declaration, and no one in Redemption Springs knew what to make of it. Maggie Fenton, the keeper of the boarding house, pushed open the screen door, her apron dusted with flour. She froze mid-step. Her eyes went wide, taking in the impossible sight before her. This mountain of a woman, holding a half-broken cowboy like he was a babe in arms. "Good Lord Almighty," Maggie whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Who did this to him?" The giant bride didn't answer. She shouldered past Maggie, her sighs filling the narrow hallway, and laid the man carefully on the long bench in the parlor. She arranged his limbs with a strange, deliberate care. Dust streaked his vest. Blood stained his shirt, but his spirit was still there, a stubborn flicker in a storm. Maggie hurried to fetch a basin of water, her sharp eyes darting between the stranger's bruises and the silent protector who towered in her small parlor. "What's your name, girl?" Maggie asked when she returned, her voice a mixture of awe and suspicion. The bride's voice was low but clear, carrying a weight that made the floorboards creak. "Elenina Hale." She gestured to the man on the bench. "And his—" The man coughed, a raw, painful sound that racked his ribs. "Fletcher," he rasped. "Fletcher Ward." His hand twitched, as if to rise and shake, but Elenina pressed it gently down. Her massive palm covered his entire hand like a shield. Maggie set the basin beside them, shaking her head. "You best get him to Doc Sullivan before nightfall. Ribs like that don't wait, and bruises like those, they don't come from falling off no horse." Just then, the sound of hooves thundered outside. Dust billowed past the window, as a group of riders galloped past the edge of town, their laughter sharp and cruel on the wind. Fletcher flinched at the sound. His eyes went dark with a fresh memory of pain. Elenina's hand tightened on his shoulder, a silent, steadying pressure. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice quiet, but her tone carried the weight of a gathering storm. Fletcher's throat worked, swallowing against the dryness and fear. "Collier's men, Judge Collier. He wants my land, wants the water." His voice dropped to a ragged whisper. "They told me I wouldn't see another sunrise if I didn't sign." "And you didn't," Elenina said. It wasn't a question. It was a truth she could see written all over his battered face. "I'd rather die than hand it over," he muttered, coughing again. Elenina's lips pressed into a thin, hard line, but her eyes flared with something fierce and untamed. She stood to her full height, her head nearly brushing the ceiling of Maggie's parlor. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo her unspoken decision. She reached for Fletcher once more. "Then you won't die." She lifted him again, ignoring his weak protests. "Not while I'm standing." Maggie hurried to open the door, her face a mask of worried resolve. The townsfolk were still lingering, whispering behind their hands, their stares crawling over Elenina's skin like knives. But she didn't falter. She carried Fletcher toward Doc Sullivan's office at the far end of the street, her shadow stretching long and imposing in the sinking sun. Each step she took sent ripples through the crowd. Men muttered into their hats. Women clutched their children tighter. Some laughed nervously, a few sneered. But a few were quiet. A few watched with something different in their eyes. Respect, curiosity, the gut feeling that they were witnessing the start of something that could not, and would not, be ignored. When she reached the doctor's door, Elenina shifted Fletcher's weight against her chest, and without breaking stride, kicked it open with her boot. The door slammed against the interior wall. Doc Sullivan, a man whose life was a collection of quiet routines, looked up from his desk, startled. His spectacles nearly tumbled off his nose. "What in heaven's name?" Elenina's voice cut through the dusty silence, calm but firm. "He needs mending, fast." Doc Sullivan rose, wiping his hands on a rag, his gaze flicking from Elenina's towering form to Fletcher's battered body. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a grave nod, he gestured to the examination table. "Lay him down. We'll see what's broken, and what can be saved." Elenina set Fletcher gently on the table, her hands lingering at his sides as if to anchor him to life itself. Fletcher's eyes flicked up to hers, glassy with pain, and his lips moved faintly. "You should leave me," he whispered. "No sense tying yourself to a man who's already half gone." Elenina leaned close, her voice so low only he could hear, her breath steady against his ear. "You're not gone," she said, "and I won't leave." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, a faint growl even though the sky was still clear. The air itself seemed to tighten, the way it does right before a storm changes everything. And in that moment, in that cramped doctor's office in the forgotten town of Redemption Springs, a vow was sealed, not just to heal wounds, but to start a war that would shake the town to its very core. The night in Redemption Springs was restless. A dry wind blew in from the plains, carrying grit that rattled against the window panes like tiny, insistent fingers. Dogs barked at shadows nobody could see. Inside Doc Sullivan's office, the lantern flickered low, casting long, dancing shapes on the walls. Fletcher lay on the cot, his ribs bound tight, his breathing shallow but steadier than before. Elenina sat in a corner, dwarfing the wooden chair she occupied. Her back was ramrod straight, her eyes sharp, as if she were daring danger itself to walk through the door. Doc poured himself a shot of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. "Never seen a woman carry a full-grown man like that," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Thought my old eyes were playing tricks on me." He studied her in the silence for a moment, then added, "You've got the strength of 3 men, girl. But the question is, what's your stake in this cowboy?" Elena's jaw tightened. She looked down at her hands. They were large, calloused, scarred. Hands that had broken stone and split wood since she was a child. Hands no suitor had ever wanted to hold. "I've been passed from place to place like unwanted freight," she said, her voice quiet but resonating in the small room. "A mail-order bride who never got claimed. They took one look at me and they laughed. They mocked. Some tried to use me. None tried to love me." She paused, the memory a bitter taste. Her eyes rose and locked on the doctor's. "But when I saw him in the dirt, broken and left to die, I knew I couldn't walk away." Fletcher stirred on the cot, his eyes half open, catching fragments of her words. He gritted his teeth and tried to sit up, a groan escaping his lips. You shouldn't be here," he rasped, the effort costing him. "Collier will come back. He doesn't leave things unfinished." Elena was on her feet in an instant, crossing to his side. Her shadow swallowed the lamplight, plunging him into darkness. "Let him come," she said, her voice like stone grinding on stone. "This time, he won't find you alone." Before another word could be said, the sound of horses echoed from the street. Not just 1 or 2. It was a small army. Hooves pounded the hard-packed earth, and angry voices were raised in the night. Doc cursed under his breath and moved to snuff out the lantern. But Elena was already at the window, her silhouette a giant, unmovable shape against the glass. Her eyes narrowed. She saw them then, 6 riders circling like vultures in the center of town. Torches flared to life, painting the night in hellish shades of orange and red. One rider spurred his horse forward and threw a burning rag against the wall of the nearby livery stable. Flames licked up the dry wood, hungry and fast. Fletcher tried to push himself up again, raw fury flashing in his eyes. "They're trying to burn the town, force me out by smoke and fear." His body trembled with the effort, but the pain was a cruel shackle, holding him down. Elena's hand pressed him firmly back to the cot. "Stay down. Your fight isn't tonight." She turned and her eyes fell on the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. She picked it up, weighing its solid heft in her grip. It felt right. She strode to the door, shoulders squared, and stepped out into the street. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and the heat of the growing fire warmed her skin. The riders jeered when they saw her. "Look what we have here. The giant freak," one of them shouted, his voice dripping with malice. "Come to join the flames, sweetheart?" Ugly laughter pealed through the dark, but Elena didn't answer. She walked toward them with slow, measured steps. With every inch of her height, every solid footfall, she made them shift uneasily in their saddles. The flames roared brighter behind her, casting her figure in a fierce, demonic glow. She stopped in the center of the road and slammed the iron poker into the dirt. Sparks leaped up around her boots. Her voice cut through the chaos, clear and cold as a winter river. "This town won't burn tonight." The riders looked at each other, a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. Then one of them spat on the ground and kicked his horse forward, drawing a long whip from his belt. He swung it at her, the leather whistling through the air, expecting her to cower or retreat. Instead, she caught the whip in one hand. With a grunt of pure power, she yanked the rider clean from his saddle. He hit the ground with a sickening thud. The others cursed, their hands flying to the pistols at their hips, but it was too late. The commotion had drawn people from their homes. Townfolk were gathering in their doorways, their eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of this giant woman standing firm while flames clawed at the night sky. She dropped the whip, her glare sweeping over the remaining men. "Ride back to your master," she growled, her voice a low, threatening rumble. "Tell him Fletcher Ward is under my protection. Tell him the next man who tries to touch what isn't his will, find my hands around his throat." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then, slowly, one by one, the riders wheeled their horses and retreated, their blustering laughter gone, replaced by muttered curses and nervous glances back over their shoulders. Maggie Fenton appeared with buckets, her voice sharp as she organized the townsfolk to douse the fire. Elena joined them, hauling barrels of water as if they were empty, the flames hissing and dying under her relentless assault. Sweat streaked her brow. Soot smeared her arms. But when the last ember faded into a wisp of smoke, the people of Redemption Springs looked at her differently. Some still whispered, but now others nodded, a new, grudging respect in their eyes. Back in the doctor's office, Fletcher had managed to sit up. His eyes were full of questions when she walked back in, silhouetted by the moonlight. "They'll be back," he said, his voice low. "Collier doesn't scare easy." Elenina knelt by his cot, her massive hand resting lightly on top of his. "Then neither do I." For the first time since she'd been dumped like unwanted cargo in Redemption Springs, the giant bride felt the faint stirrings of something like belonging. It wasn't in the whispers of the town. It was in the unwavering gaze of the man who, despite his own pain and bruises, looked at her as if she wasn't too big, too strange, or too unwanted. He looked at her as if she was exactly who he needed. And outside, in the cooling night air, under a sky full of indifferent stars, Judge Collier's men were already planning their next move. The fire was just a warning. The real storm was yet to come. Judge Collier arrived in Redemption Springs at sunrise. He didn't ride in on horseback like an ordinary man. He came in a polished black carriage, pulled by two matching black stallions that snorted plumes of steam in the cool morning air. Dust rolled away from the wheels, as if the earth itself was making way for his power. He stepped out, dressed in fine, dark wool, a silver watch chain gleaming against his vest. A smile was stretched thin across his lips, the kind of smile that never, ever touched his cold, calculating eyes. As he walked down the main street, men fell quiet. Women instinctively pulled their children a little closer. Even the town sheriff, a man paid to keep the peace, kept his distance. Collier wasn't the law. He was the man who owned it. His money had built the courthouse. His donations paid the sheriff's salary. He owned half the saloon and held the mortgages of nearly every rancher in the basin. And now he had come for Fletcher Ward's land. He strolled into Doc Sullivan's office without knocking, as if it already belonged to him. Fletcher struggled to sit upright on the cot, his body still a road map of bruises and stiffness. Instantly, Elenina moved to stand between them, her shoulders blocking Collier's view like a wall of living stone. "Well, well," Collier drawled, slowly removing his leather gloves, one finger at a time. "Imagine my profound disappointment when my men returned to tell me that not only is Fletcher Ward still breathing, but he's acquired himself a protector." His eyes traveled up Elenina's form slowly, lingering on her height, her broad shoulders, her clenched fists. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "I've seen oxen smaller than you, girl. Tell me, do you truly plan to fight the entire world for this broken-down rancher?" Elenina didn't flinch. Her voice was steady. "If the world comes for him, yes." Collier's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold gleam of a predator. "Brave words, but this is business, not a back-alley brawl. Mr. Ward owes me for back taxes, overdue notes, and a number of other inconveniences. That land will be mine before the month is out." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Unless, of course, you'd rather buy him some time. With yourself." His meaning dripped like poison into the silence that followed. Fletcher's fists clenched, fury flashing across his battered face. "Don't you dare talk to her like that." But Elenina's voice cut through his anger, calm and as hard as granite. "I've been bought and sold before," she said, her eyes locked on Collier's. "Never again." She took a step closer, towering over the judge, her shadow falling across his polished shoes. If you think you can scare me, you're a fool. If you think you can touch him again, you'll lose a lot more than just land. For the first time, a flicker of something other than amusement crossed Collier's face. His eyes hardened. The mask slipped, and for a second she saw the cold, dangerous thing that lived behind it. He leaned in, his voice a venomous hiss meant only for her and Fletcher. Be careful, girl. This town already laughs at you. Don't give them a reason to fear you too. Fear makes men do very ugly things. Then, just as quickly, he straightened up, pulling his gloves back on with a soft snap. He turned toward the door. You have 1 week, Ward. 1 week to sign over the double H, or I will claim it in fire and in blood. When he was gone, a heavy silence pressed down on the room. Fletcher sagged back against the cot, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He won't wait a week, he said, his voice hollow. He'll come sooner. Elena began to pace the floor, her boots thudding a rhythmic, angry beat against the wooden boards. She had faced cruelty her whole life. She knew mockery, rejection, the sharp sting of being unwanted. But this was different. This wasn't just personal hatred. This was a war waged by a powerful man on anyone too small, too poor, or too weak to fight back. And she was standing right in the middle of it. That evening, the saloon was thick with whispers, rising like smoke to the rafters. Some said Fletcher should just give up the land before more blood was spilled. Others muttered that the giant bride had brought a curse on the town, attracting trouble by refusing to step aside like a proper woman. But a few voices spoke up for her. Maggie Fenton, the young ranch hand Ira from Fletcher's place, even old Doc Sullivan. They spoke quietly, but their words carried weight. If she hadn't stood her ground last night, Maggie said, her voice sharp, the livery would be ash. This whole town could be ash. Still, Elenina felt the stares when she walked Fletcher back to the boarding house, his arm leaning on her for support. She met every look without blinking, daring anyone to speak the word freak aloud. No one did, not to her face. As they passed the saloon, Judge Collier's deputy, a burly man named Rusk, with a scarred face and cruel eyes, slammed a notice onto the wall. The paper was stark white against the dark wood. Auction, it read in big black letters. The Double H Ranch, 1 week from today. Court approved. Rusk's eyes locked on Elenina, a cruel grin spreading across his face. Unless the lady here wants to change our minds sooner. His words were slick with suggestion, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. Fletcher lurched forward, a raw sound of fury in his throat, but his injuries made him stumble. Elenina caught him, her grip like steel, holding him steady. Then she turned her gaze on Rusk. Her eyes were like a storm breaking over the mountains. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The entire saloon went quiet as the deputy's grin faltered, then died completely under the sheer, silent weight of her stare. He spat on the floor, muttered a curse under his breath, and stormed out. Later that night, back at the boarding house, Fletcher sat at the small kitchen table, his head in his hands. I can't fight him, Elenina, not like this. He's too strong, too rich. He owns the law, the guns. He owns this whole town. Elenina leaned across the table, her voice steady but fierce. Then we won't fight him alone. Her gaze was intense, burning with a fire he hadn't seen before. We'll fight him with the truth. We'll find proof of his crimes. She paused, then raised her large, calloused hands into the lamplight. And if the truth fails, we'll fight him with these. The same hands that had lifted him from the dust. The same hands that had stopped armed men on horseback with nothing but raw strength. Fletcher looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted deep within him. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper. Respect. Awe. You don't even know me, he whispered. Elenina's voice softened, just a fraction. I know enough. I know you didn't give up your land when it would have been the easiest thing in the world to do. I know you've got fight in you, even if your body's broken." She looked away for a second, then met his eyes again, her own vulnerability, a shocking, brief flicker. "And I know one thing more. You're the first man who's ever looked at me and not seen a monster." Fletcher's throat tightened. Words failed him. He could only nod, his eyes burning with an emotion he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. But hope alone wouldn't stop Judge Collier. Outside, in the darkness, riders were moving. They were sharpening blades, checking their rifles, and preparing for the week ahead. A week that would decide whether the Double H Ranch, and everyone in it, lived or burned. The week promised by Judge Collier was a lie. He never intended to wait that long. On the third night, before the moon had even reached its peak, the sound came. A low, distant rumble at first, then growing louder, more distinct. The sound of dozens of hooves thundering across the dry plains, all heading in one direction. Toward the Double H Ranch. Fletcher had insisted on going home. His ribs were still a torment, but he was a man who would not be chased off his own land. "I'll die in my own house before I let him scare me out of it," he'd told Elenina, his jaw set. And she had gone with him, her presence a silent, solid promise. Even the ranch hands, young men who had once smirked at her size, now nodded with a quiet respect when she passed. They had seen what she could do. That night, the lights in the bunkhouse went dark early. The men were uneasy, their guns kept close to hand. Out in the fields, the cattle grew restless, lowing and stamping in their pens as if they could smell the storm about to break. Fletcher sat by the main window of the ranch house, a rifle laid across his knees, his face pale in the moonlight, but his eyes steady. Elenina stood on the porch, a dark, towering silhouette against the star-dusted sky. The wind tugged at her loose hair as her eyes remained fixed on the dark horizon. When the riders came, they looked like a wave of fire rolling across the plains. Torches blazed, held high, casting flickering, demonic shadows. Shouts cut through the night, harsh and eager for violence. Elenina gripped the handle of the heavy wood-splitting axe she'd taken from the woodpile. Her jaw was as hard as iron. She didn't wait for them to reach the house. She stepped off the porch and moved into the open yard, planting her feet wide, a figure carved from granite and fury against the approaching flames. The first rider broke through the flimsy wooden fence, raising his torch high to throw it onto the roof of the barn. He never got the chance. Elenina charged, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for her size. She swung the axe in a powerful, sweeping arc, not to kill, but to shatter the torch, sending a shower of burning embers scattering harmlessly into the dirt. The man reeled back on his horse, stunned by her sudden assault. Before he could recover, she seized the collar of his shirt and ripped him from the saddle, tossing him into the dust like a sack of grain. Gunfire cracked from the bunkhouse as the ranch hands joined the fight, their shots kicking up dirt around the riders' horses. Fletcher stumbled from the porch, firing his own rifle, his face contorted with pain, but his aim steady enough to drive back the men who tried to circle around the side of the house. Elenina moved like a wall of destruction through the chaos. Her massive arms deflected blows that would have felled a smaller person. Her voice roared over the din of gunfire and shouting, a sound of pure, primal rage. "This land is not yours to take." Then came Rusk, Collier's deputy. He rode in hard from the east, a rope coiled in his hand, his grin wolfish in the torchlight. He swung the rope wide, the lasso catching Elenina around her shoulders and arms, pinning them to her sides. He yanked with all his strength, the horse digging its hooves in. She staggered, but she did not fall. With a furious cry that seemed to shake the very ground, she dug in her own heels, gripped the thick rope, and heaved. She dragged the horse and its rider down together in a tangle of flailing limbs. Rusk scrambled to his feet, spitting blood and dirt, his face a mask of hate. He drew his revolver. He aimed it straight at her chest. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Fletcher saw it from across the yard. He shouted her name, a raw, desperate sound. He tried to raise his rifle again, but a spasm of agony from his bruised ribs seized him, making him cry out in pain. The shot rang out, sharp and deafening in the night. Elena's head snapped to the side, her long hair flying. For one terrible, heart-stopping beat, Fletcher thought she'd been struck. He thought he had watched her die. But when the smoke cleared, Elena was still standing. The bullet had torn through the thick fabric of her sleeve, grazing her skin, leaving a hot, stinging line of fire. But her spirit was untouched. Her eyes, however, had changed. The fury was gone, replaced by something colder, deadlier. She crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. Her hand clamped down on Rusk's wrist with crushing force. He cried out as bones ground together. The gun clattered to the dirt. Her voice was a low, lethal whisper. "I warned you." With one swift, powerful motion, she hurled him backwards. He flew through the air and slammed against the fence, his body going limp as he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The other riders faltered. Seeing their leader taken down so brutally, their courage evaporated. One of them shouted a retreat, and the rest turned tail, dropping their torches in the dirt as they fled back into the safety of the night. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of a few dying flames and the ragged, desperate breaths of the men who had just fought for their home. Elena stood in the center of it all, her chest heaving, soot streaked across her face and arms, her knuckles raw and bleeding. She turned slowly and looked toward Fletcher. And for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, she looked uncertain. She looked vulnerable, as if she was waiting to see if the sheer, violent force of her strength had finally saved him, or if it had just scared him away for good. Fletcher limped forward, his rifle forgotten in the dirt. His eyes were fixed on her, his face lit by the flicker of the last burning embers. He stopped just before her, so close he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. "You kept your vow," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "No one hurt me tonight." His hand rose slowly, shakily, and he rested it against her soot-blackened cheek. His touch was gentle, reverent. "But Elena," he whispered, his eyes searching hers, "who's going to protect you?" Her breath caught in her throat. The question broke through walls she had spent a lifetime building. She had always been the strong one, the one others feared or mocked or used. No one, in her entire life, had ever asked who shielded her. And in Fletcher's eyes, she saw the answer. Not pity, not fear, but a promise just as fierce, just as unshakable as the one she had given him in the dust. Around them, the ranch hands began to gather, murmuring in awe. Just then, Maggie Fenton arrived in a wagon, her apron flapping in the wind, already scolding the men for letting Elena take the brunt of the fight. But even her sharp words died on her lips when she saw the way Fletcher and Elena stood together in the ruins of the attack, bruised, battered, and soot-stained, but utterly, completely unbroken. Days later, when the town gathered for an emergency council meeting, Judge Collier swept in, his face smug, expecting a full surrender. Instead, he found half the town standing behind Elena and Fletcher. Doc Sullivan, his hands trembling slightly, produced old ledgers proving years of Collier's fraudulent land claims. Maggie Fenton stood and spoke of the fire Elena had put out, her voice ringing with conviction. Young Ira Boone told of the night riders she had dragged from their horses with her bare hands. The room thundered, not with fear of Collier, but with voices demanding justice. Collier sneered, his power slipping through his fingers. He looked to the sheriff for support, but the man at last found his courage. He unpinned his badge, laid it on the table, and refused to be Collier's puppet any longer. The council stripped Collier of his claim. The townsfolk, united for the first time in memory, drove his men from the valley. And for the first time, The town of Redemption Springs felt like its name might actually mean something. When the dust finally settled, Fletcher stood on the steps of the courthouse, still leaning slightly from his healing wounds. Elenina stood beside him, taller than any man there, her presence commanding a respectful silence. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. His voice carried clear across the town square. "She lifted me when I couldn't stand," he said to the crowd. "She kept her vow when almost every person here turned away. And if she'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my life keeping her safe, the way she's kept me." The crowd gasped. A wave of shock and wonder rippled through them. Elenina froze, her heart pounding so loud she thought the whole town could hear it. For so long she had been the unwanted one, the unseen one, the joke. Now this man, bruised, scarred, stubborn but true, was asking for her hand in front of all the people who had once scorned her. Tears burned in her eyes, hot and cleansing, as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't name. "And no one will ever hurt us again." The town erupted, some in tears, some in stunned silence, some in cheers. But it didn't matter what they thought anymore. In that moment, the giant bride, the woman who had once been cast aside like freight, found not just a husband, but a home, a people, and a place where her incredible strength was no longer a curse. It was their salvation. And as a light snow began to dust the distant mountain peaks, Elenina and Fletcher walked down the steps hand in hand, ready to face whatever storms the West would send their way. Together. The years that followed turned the vow spoken in dust into a life built on solid stone. Winter came first, cold and sharp, settling a blanket of pristine snow across the Double H Ranch, a blanket of forgiveness. Fletcher still bore the marks of Collier's war, the stiff ache in his ribs on cold mornings, the faint white scar that cut through his eyebrow. But he also carried something new, a deep, quiet peace that had settled into his bones. Each morning, he woke to the smell of wood smoke curling from the stone chimney, and to the sight of Elenina already outside, her sleeves rolled high, feeding the cattle in the crisp dawn air, her laughter a sound that startled the quiet and made it feel alive. She was no longer the giant bride whispered about in saloons. She had become the spine of the ranch, the quiet protector of the valley. Though a few whispers might have lingered in the darkest corners of town, most of Redemption Springs now spoke her name with a deep and abiding respect. When children passed her on the boardwalk, they no longer giggled and pointed. They stared with wide-eyed, silent awe. Maggie Fenton often joked that Elenina had scared the sense back into the whole town. But the truth ran deeper. The people of Redemption Springs had seen her stand between them and ruin, between fire and fear, and in her long shadow, they had found a courage they never knew they possessed. The wedding was small. They held it beneath the ancient cottonwoods by the stream that cut through Fletcher's land. There were no velvet gowns or polished carriages, just townsfolk who came bearing fresh-baked pies, warm quilts, and well-worn fiddles. Elenina wore a simple dress sewn hastily by Maggie, the seams stretched wide but holding strong across her powerful frame. Fletcher wore his best vest, mended twice over. They exchanged their vows with trembling voices, Fletcher's hand completely swallowed in Elenina's. When the preacher finally said they were one, the small crowd cheered loud enough to chase the crows from the trees for a mile around. That night, Fletcher insisted on carrying her across the threshold of the ranch house. Not because she couldn't carry herself, she could have carried him and the threshold both, but because, for the first time in her life, she let someone else be strong for her. His arms shook with the effort, his laughter breaking into hers when he nearly stumbled. But when he set her down gently inside, his lips pressed to her ear, he whispered that old vow, making it new again. "No one will hurt you again. Not while I draw breath." She answered with a vow of her own, her voice thick with unshed tears. "And no one will hurt you, not while I stand." Spring brought new life, calves in the pastures, green shoots of wheat pushing through the dark earth, and a child into their arms. Their daughter was born in the soft, gray light of dawn, her first cries sharp and full of a fierce, demanding life. Elenina wept as Fletcher placed the tiny, fragile baby into her arms. Her massive, scarred hands cradled the infant with a tenderness that astonished even herself. They named her Clara, after Elenina's mother, the only other person who had ever told her she was beautiful just as she was. Fletcher would watch his wife in the evenings, singing softly to their daughter, her voice low and steady as a heartbeat. He marveled at how this woman, once mocked as too big, too rough, too much for this world, could now rock a child smaller than her own palm with a gentleness he hadn't thought possible. And he marveled, too, at the way she still looked at him. Not as a broken man she had saved from the dirt, but as the partner she had chosen. Redemption Springs changed right along with them. A proper schoolhouse was built, paid for by ranchers pooling their coin, but only after Elenina marched into a town council meeting and refused to leave until they agreed to it. Fletcher taught a grown-up Ira Boone how to properly run a herd, and one day he handed the young man a set of keys to a small cabin on the far ridge. "Go on," he told him, his words echoing Elenina's long ago. "Build something of your own." Even the saloon softened its edges. Where men had once mocked Elenina, now they told her story in hushed, reverent tones to weary travelers passing through. They embellished the tale, of course, making her taller, the flames higher, the fight more legendary. But they never forgot the truth of it, the night she stood alone against torches and guns, and won. She became a local legend before she even knew it. Years passed like seasons. Clara grew tall and stubborn, with her mother's fire in her eyes and her father's quiet strength in her smile. She would climb onto Elenina's shoulders, high above the world, and declare, "Mama's the tallest mountain in the world." Fletcher would laugh, ruffling her hair. "No, child," he'd correct her gently. "She's the strongest." On the 10th anniversary of that fateful night, the day Elenina had first lifted Fletcher from the dirt, the whole town gathered again by the cottonwoods near the stream. Snow touched the highest peaks. The air carried the clean, sharp scent of sage. Fletcher stood beside Elenina, his hand held firmly in hers, their daughter playing at their feet. He looked out at the faces before him, the same faces that had once whispered, doubted, and mocked. His voice carried over them, steady and proud. "I was broken once," he began, "left to die. But this woman lifted me. Not just from the dirt, but from despair. She kept her vow. She gave me a life, a family, and a home." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "And if you take nothing else from our story, take this. The world always underestimates love. It underestimates strength. And it surely underestimates women like her. Don't you ever make that same mistake." Elenina leaned her forehead against his, tears of gratitude streaking down her cheeks. The crowd erupted, not in whispers, but in heartfelt cheers. Clara tugged at her mother's dress, her small voice piping up. "Mama, is the story over now?" Elenina knelt, gathering her daughter into a powerful, gentle hug. She looked at Fletcher, at the ranch stretching out behind him, at the town that was finally their home. Then she shook her head, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. "No, child," she whispered. "This story is only just beginning." And as the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the western sky in brilliant streaks of fire and gold, the vow that had once been spoken over a broken man in a dusty street became more than just a promise. It became the foundation of a life. It was proof that even in the harshest lands, against the longest odds, love could grow as wide, as strong, and as enduring as the western sky itself. If this story hit you, subscribe now and tap the bell so you never miss the next chapter. One click, then YouTube brings our newest film straight to you.